Just while we set up, I'll introduce our next member of the panel. His name's Michael, and he's going to talk to us on Burton and Vienna.
Okay, fine. So, good morning. The first thing I'd like to point out is that the title of my presentation is Captain Richard Burton and Vienna, because at the time, by the time he became Sir, although he was still serving as Her Britannic Majesty's Consul in Austro-Hungarian Trieste, by that time Burton was no longer had any real contact with the city we're meeting in today. And it's also important to set the scene a little by mentioning Burton's consular posting to Trieste. Not only because it was as a consequence of this that he was able to come to Vienna for the first time in May 1873, but also because it gives me the opportunity to use some of the foreign language words my old geography teacher, Mr. Davis, taught us in class 3B in the mid-1960s, words which I have never ever had the chance to use until now. Trieste at the time was the largest port in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with Vienna as its capital. And so Trieste is here where Burton served. Here we can see the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And it was one of the empire's largest cities. It was the entrepot, thank you Mr. Davis, it was the entrepot for a vast hinterland, thank you again Mr. Davis, which included half a dozen areas with their capital cities, which are now independent countries. Slovenia, Croatia, Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and of course Austria itself. After their arrival in Trieste, one of the first things the Burtons did was to leave, as he so often did. And they went on an extended tour of Italy. Remember that Italy was then a foreign country for Austro-Hungarian Trieste. Isabel noted that they visited Rome, Assisi, Perugia, Florence, Pistoia, Bologna, and thence to Venice, and after a while back to Trieste, where they stayed just to change baggage, as Richard was engaged as a reporter to a newspaper for the Great Exhibition in Vienna. This newspaper was in fact the magazine The Athenaeum, and I shall quote from this later. The Great Exhibition of 1873 in Vienna is generally considered to have been the fifth in the series of officially recognised world fairs, exhibitions, expos, following London and Paris, twice each in the 1850s and 60s. It opened on the 1st of May 1873, that is pretty much 150 years ago, with the main grounds being in the Prater near the Danube. Under its motto, Kultur und Erziehung, that is, culture and education, it is thought to have cost over £23 million at the time and attracted over 7 million visitors before closing on All Souls Day, the 2nd of November 1873. There were over 25,000 exhibitors, with an enormous effort made by up-and-coming nations such as Japan, New Zealand and newly unified Italy to show off their history, culture and achievements. And indeed, the Ottoman Empire, anxious to show it was now part of Europe and no longer the Habsburgs' age-old enemy. Burton's report for the Athenaeum was published over 2 editions on May the 10th and May the 17th, 1873. He began his first article thus. I have just returned from the opening of the Weltausstellung, that is the Vienna exhibition, in a storm of wind and rain. At 9 a.m. we set out with no small apprehension of what was to come. The official programme ordered us to be present between that hour and 11 a.m. and threatened us with confinement until 6 p.m. There is a restaurant, but it is not yet open. A cake of chocolate suffices for the other sex, but our equivalent of tobacco was forbidden, and the furtive bun is not of a satisfactory nature. The day of St. Philip and St. James opened gloomily. This May Day of May Days began with that slow, drizzling rain which is the despair of sightseers, and with that dreary French grey sky which would deform paradise itself. As often in his accounts, the weather, or better, the wet, cold and pleasant weather played an important part in Burton's descriptions. But he did say, the crater now bears a city of its own, not a city of glass and cast iron, but a solid and substantial settlement of zinc and stone. It would contain the citizens of Reykjavik in a corner. It would lodge easily and comfortably all the inhabitants of Iceland in a wing, and it would give standing room to the whole population of Syria and Palestine. And here we should note that less than 2 years earlier, Burton had still been British consul in Damascus, and before taking up his post in Trieste, he had spent the previous summer investigating sulfur mining in Iceland. So both these comparisons were with places fresh in his mind. About the official opening ceremony, he wrote, when the royalties had taken their stand upon the estrade, John Strauss made himself heard, followed by a short speech by the Archduke Protector. The Kaiser briefly replied in an audible voice and in a manner pleasingly empathetic, declared officially the World Exhibition of the Year of Grace 1873 open to the world. Loud plaudits, fanfares, and a second salute. And then the first part of Burton's report to the Athenaeum concluded, the Imperial Party disappeared by the southern portal at 2:40 p.m. and at 3 p.m. we were all en route for our carriages. Then the wind and the rain, I hastily closed this letter to secure the post. The second half of Captain Burton's report was published a week later and begins, my last letter to you was perhaps a little over-gloomy. The sun of Friday and Saturday made us feel somewhat more charitable, although early May has out-Apriled April. Now there are bursts of fiery heat, as full of the agues as the sun in March. When it came to the weather, Burton could always find something to complain about. The second report contained much more of a genuine description of the buildings, layout and facilities at the Vienna exhibition, although much of the exhibition space remained incomplete, even after the official opening. Come with me to the rotunda, that is the centrepiece of the exhibition, which reminds us pleasantly of the physical suffering endured on May Day, not the least torment being the cutting drafts that converge like charging columns upon the floor of the house. We passed through the Haupteingang, or Prater entrance, out the Kaiserallee, between the squirts, water fountains, and a pair of lions, very contemplative and benevolent looking beast kings. The Sundportal, the place of honour, is copiously adorned with statues of peace, prosperity and similar highly interesting personages, and bears between the names of the Emperor and the Empress the mystic legend Viribus Unicia, which is repeated upon all the main entrances. I can't read all of Captain Burton's 2 reports today, but if you're interested, you can find them on Burtoniana.org in the section Minor Works. In her biography of her husband, The Life, Isabel wrote extensively about their time in Vienna, including this anecdote about her husband. It was during the Viennese exhibition when supplies at the hotels were charged enormous prices, and all portions were most homeopathic, and I presume that means very, very small. A waiter brought Richard a cup of coffee, not Turkish coffee, but a doll's cup with a chestnut water, which Europeans presume to call coffee. "What is that?" asked Richard, looking at it curiously. "Coffee for one, sir." "Oh, is it indeed?" Inspecting it even more curiously. Then bring me coffee for 10. The waiter returned with a common-sized cup of coffee. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Isabel was able to use her family's 300-year-old Habsburg title, so she was literally Gräfin Isabel Arundel. But Richard was just a lowly consul. She wrote, "Whilst we were there," that is in Vienna, "we went to the Viennese court. There was such a great difficulty about Richard because consuls are not admissible at the Viennese court. But upon the emperor being told of this, he said, 'Fancy being obliged to exclude such a man as Burton because he is a consul. Has he no other profession?' And they said, 'Yes, Your Majesty, he has been in the army.' So he said, 'Oh, time to come as a military man, not a consul.'" Isabel continued with this excruciatingly sycophantic description of the Viennese court. "It was 3 weeks of incessant society and gaiety. I do not know when I have met so many delightful people. I was very much dazzled by the court. I thought everything so beautifully done, so arranged to give everyone pleasure, and somehow it was the graciousness that was in itself a welcome. I shall never forget the first night that I saw the Empress, a vision of beauty clothed in silver, crowned with water lilies, with large roses of diamonds and emeralds around her small head, and her beautiful hair descending all down her dress in festoons." More prosaically, Isabel concluded her description of the Burtons' brief adventure in Vienna with, "In the hotel, our humble bill, and we had nothing but absolute necessities, was £163 for 3 weeks. And that £163 bill for 3 weeks was about a quarter of Richard's annual salary as Her Britannic Majesty's Consul in Trieste. However, this was not the end of Burton's link to Vienna. He managed to invoke Vienna as part of a smokescreen to hide his authorship of his extended mystical poem, the Cassida, published in 1880. Under the nom de plume Frank Baker, as Francis, Burton's second name, and plus his mother's maiden name, Burton claimed to be the translator of an original work written by Haji Abdul el-Yazdi, the Cassida. He further claimed that the translation was written and published in Vienna in November 1880. And in the foreword, he wrote, "To the reader, the translator has ventured to entitle a Lay of the Higher Law the following composition, which aims at being in advance of its time." Let's remember that this translator was Burton himself. And in the endnotes are especially enlightening sections, and honest too. He, the original author, that is Burton himself, had travelled far and wide with his eyes open. To a natural facility, a knack of language learning, he added a store of desultory various reading. Nor was he ignorant of the ologies and the triumphs of modern scientific discovery. Briefly, his memory was so well stored that he had every talent, save that of using his talents. This lament, this autobiographical lament, shows how much Burton considered his life a failure in 1880. As I mentioned, the year the Cassida was published in Vienna. But remember, in the last decade of his life, he did go on to translate and publish 17 volumes of The Thousand Nights and a Night, the Kama Sutra, Perfume Garden, etc., to be knighted, and recognized in his obituaries and then by his biographers to be truly a national treasure. And let's be realistic, no one, but no one, would organise even an afternoon tea party to discuss the life, work and achievements of John Hanning Speke. Captain Sir Richard Francis Burton's legacy, however, lives on, and not only today in Vienna. The story does not end here.
Thank you, Mick. That's wonderful. Would you take questions now?
Afterwards.
Or maybe afterwards?
If anybody wants to.